The mahogany table stretched across the boardroom like a chasm, its surface reflecting the amber glow of gaslight through tall windows. Outside, the streets of Cleveland hummed with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the distant whistle of locomotives carrying crude oil from Pennsylvania's newest wells. It was 1870, and in that room, surrounded by the scent of leather-bound ledgers and the weight of industrial ambition, a 31-year-old man named John Davison Rockefeller was about to make a decision that would reshape the very architecture of power itself. He didn't know it then, but the choice he was contemplating would create a system so intricate, so self-reinforcing, so quietly transformational, that more than a century later you would still be living inside its invisible framework. The lamplight caught the sharp angles of his face as he studied the numbers before him, each figure representing not just profit margins, but the blueprint for something unprecedented. What he built wasn't just a company. It was a machine that would teach every corporation, every government, every financial institution that followed exactly how power consolidates, how competition disappears, and how systems, once set in motion, become virtually impossible to escape. Here's the paradox that should make you pause and reconsider everything you think you know about how the modern world operates. Every time you fill your car with gasoline, every time a corporation announces a merger, every time you hear about market consolidation or regulatory capture, you're witnessing the echoes of decisions made in boardrooms lit by gaslight over 150 years ago. The structures governing how wealth concentrates, how industries organize themselves, how government and business intersect, these aren't modern innovations. They're the long-term mathematical inheritance of patterns that began when a young bookkeeper in Cleveland realized that controlling the refining of oil was more powerful than simply finding it. What makes this story different from every other tale of America and industrialists is that Rockefeller didn't just build wealth. He engineered a template that every sector would eventually follow, creating the invisible rules that govern how markets function today. And the most unsettling part is that it all began with decisions that seemed perfectly rational at the time. In the early 1860s, when crude oil was first discovered bubbling from the ground in western Pennsylvania, the landscape resembled nothing so much as controlled chaos. Wooden derricks sprouted like mechanical trees across Titusville and Oil Creek, each one representing someone's bet that the earth beneath their feet held liquid fortune. The air was thick with the smell of petroleum and the sound of drilling, a constant percussion that marked the rhythm of a new kind of gold rush. But here's what most people missed while they focused on pulling oil from the ground. A young man in Cleveland, 40 miles away, was studying the numbers with the precision of a mathematician and the patience of a chess master. Rockefeller had started as a bookkeeper, and bookkeepers see patterns that others miss. He noticed that while everyone was rushing to drill wells, very few were thinking about what happened to the oil afterward. It had to be refined into kerosene for lamps, the primary use at the time, and refining required infrastructure, expertise, and most importantly, scale and strategic discipline. While prospectors fought over drilling rights, Rockefeller was quietly calculating something different. He realized that controlling 10% of the wells meant very little if you could control 50% of the refining capacity. The oil had to flow through refineries to become useful, and refineries required significant capital investment, technical knowledge, and strategic positioning near transportation networks. What others saw as a risky, volatile commodity business, Rockefeller viewed as a puzzle with a mathematical solution. In 1863, he built his first refinery in Cleveland, positioning it strategically between the oil fields of Pennsylvania and the markets of the East Coast. The building itself was unremarkable, a collection of wooden structures and metal tanks that process the crude oil into the clear, bright kerosene that lit American homes after sunset. But the thinking behind its placement revealed a mind that understood systems rather than just transactions. But here's where the story takes its first crucial turn, the moment when personal ambition transformed into something more systematic. Rockefeller discovered that success in oil wasn't about finding the resource, it was about controlling the choke points. By 1865, his refinery was processing hundreds of barrels per day, but he was already seeing further down the chain of cause and effect. The railroads that transported oil held enormous power over refiners, charging different rates to different customers based on volume and negotiating leverage. Smaller refiners paid premium rates, while larger operations could demand discounts. This created a feedback loop where size begat advantages, and advantages enabled further growth. Rockefeller began to see the entire industry as an interconnected system, and where controlling key nodes could yield disproportionate influence over the whole network. What he didn't realize was that he was pioneering a form of economic organization that would become the template for corporate power across every sector of the modern economy. The winter of 1867 brought more than snow to Cleveland. It brought clarity to a mind already predisposed towards systematic thinking. Rockefeller had been watching his competitors struggle with the feast or famine cycles of the oil business. When crude prices were low, refiners made healthy margins. When drilling increased and crude became expensive, many refiners operated at losses. The volatility was crushing smaller operations, but Rockefeller saw it as opportunity disguised as chaos. He began approaching struggling refiners with a proposition that seemed generous on the surface but was mathematically devastating to competition. He would buy their facilities, often paying fair prices, and integrate their capacity into his growing operation. The sellers walked away with cash and often continued as managers, while Rockefeller gained not just their refining capacity but their customer relationships, their supply contracts, and most importantly, their market share. Each acquisition made the next one easier because his growing size gave him better rates from railroads, better terms from suppliers, and better negotiating power with customers. By 1870, when he formally incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, Rockefeller controlled 10% of America's oil refining capacity. The name itself was revealing. Standard Oil wasn't named for dominance or ambition, but for consistency. In an industry plagued by varying quality and unpredictable supply, Rockefeller promised standardization. His kerosene burned cleaner and brighter than most competitors, not because of superior crude oil, but because of more stable refining methods and rigorous quality control. But here's what made Standard Oil different from every other industrial success story of its era. Rockefeller wasn't content to simply outcompete rivals in the marketplace. He was redesigning the marketplace itself, creating a system where competition became mathematical, impossible rather than merely difficult. The mechanisms he developed were so elegant and self-reinforcing that they would be copied, refined, and institutionalized across industries for the next century and a half. The true genius of what Rockefeller built reveals itself not in any single decision, but in how each choice created conditions that made the next choice inevitable. Take the railroad agreements that began in the early 1870s. On the surface, these appeared to be simple volume discounts. Standard Oil shipped more barrels than any other refiner, so naturally they received better rates. But Rockefeller negotiated something unprecedented in its sophistication. Not only did Standard Oil pay lower shipping rates than competitors, but the railroads agreed to pay Standard Oil rebates on oil shipped by other companies. This meant that every barrel a competitor shipped actually provided revenue to Standard Oil, while increasing the competitors' costs. The more competitors used the railroads, the stronger Standard Oil became. It was a system that transformed competitor activity into fuel for Standard Oil's growth, creating what economists would later recognize as a network effect decades before the term existed. What happened next would reshape not just the oil industry, but the fundamental relationship between business and government, between size and power, between competition and control. The rebate system was just the beginning. Rockefeller realized that if he could control transportation, he could control the entire industry without owning a single oil well. He began acquiring pipeline companies, tank car fleets, and terminal facilities. By 1879, Standard Oil owned or controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. But more importantly, it controlled the infrastructure that made refining possible. Competitors found themselves in an impossible position. They could drill oil, but they couldn't transport it economically. They could build refineries, but they couldn't distribute our products competitively. The system Rockefeller had created was no longer just a company. It was an ecosystem where all the vital functions of an entire industry flowed through a single organization. But here's where the story becomes something larger than business history. Here's where it becomes the blueprint for how power consolidates in any complex system. Rockefeller had discovered something that would be rediscovered by every dominant force that followed. True power doesn't come from being the best at what everyone else is doing. It comes from controlling the conditions under which everyone else operates. Standard Oil's dominance wasn't maintained through superior products or lower prices, though it often offered both. It was maintained through structural advantages that made meaningful competition impossible. And the most remarkable aspect of this system was how rational it appeared to everyone involved. Railroad executives received guaranteed volume from Standard Oil. Consumers received consistent, high-quality kerosene at stable prices. Even many competitors found it more profitable to sell to Standard Oil than to compete against it. The system worked for almost everyone, which is precisely what made it so difficult to challenge and so easy to replicate. The most chilling aspect of what Rockefeller accomplished wasn't the monopoly itself. It was how he made monopoly feel like the natural order of things. By the 1880s, when congressional investigators began examining Standard Oil's practices, they discovered something that defied their understanding of how markets were supposed to function. Competition hadn't simply been defeated through superior products or lower prices. Competition had been systematically restructured out of existence. The rebate agreements, the pipeline control, the transportation monopolies, these weren't aggressive business tactics. They were architectural changes to the marketplace itself. And the most unsettling discovery was that everyone involved, from railroad executives to government officials to competing refiners, had made rational decisions that collectively created an irrational system. Here's where you need to understand that what happened next would echo through every industry, every market, every economic structure that followed. In 1882, Rockefeller's lawyers created something unprecedented in corporate law. They called it a trust, and on the surface, it appeared to be a simple legal mechanism for managing multiple companies. But what they had actually invented was a new form of economic organization that would become the template for corporate consolidation across every sector of modern life. The Standard Oil Trust wasn't just larger than its competitors. It was organized according to completely different principles. Instead of competing companies fighting for market share, the trust operated as a unified system where each component served the optimization of the who. Leisure refineries were positioned not to maximize their individual profits, but to maximize the efficiency of the entire network. Transportation routes were designed not for competitive advantage, but for systematic control of supply chains, a concept many industries still mirror today. When the Supreme Court finally dismantled the Standard Oil Trust in 1911, breaking it into 37 separate companies, observers celebrated the triumph of competition over monopoly. But what they failed to recognize was that the blueprint had already been copied, refined, and institutionalized across every corner of the economy. The companies that emerged from Standard Oil's breakup, Exxon, Chevron, and Mobil, didn't compete in the traditional sense. They operated within the same structural framework that Rockefeller had pioneered, using the same principles of systematic control that had made the original trust so formidable. The system had learned to survive its own dissolution. Today, when you witness corporate mergers that create companies too large to fail, when you see industries consolidate around a handful of dominant players, when you observe how technological platforms become infrastructure that competitors must use to reach customers, you're seeing the mathematical inheritance of patterns that began in a gaslit boardroom in Cleveland. The mechanisms have evolved, but the underlying logic remains unchanged. Power still flows to those who control the conditions under which others operate, and those conditions, once established, become nearly impossible to escape. If this changed how you see the structures that shape your world, if you want to understand the patterns that history repeats but schools never teach, then you've glimpsed something that most will never recognize. The system Rockefeller built didn't disappear when his company was broken apart. It simply learned new forms, found new industries, and continued influencing how consolidation and scale shape the modern world.